Disarming Iraq and Iran. Chomsky calls for relying on, quote, diplomatic and economic measures rather than military ones in confronting terror, end quote. Indeed, it was such a measure that the UN employed with its sanctions against Iraq that resulted in the deaths of over 1.5 million Iraqis, especially children, under the period of peace between America's two shooting wars against Iraq. While Chomsky spends several pages in Failed States railing against the murderous regime of sanctions against Iraq, he fails to mention that he himself advocated these sanctions in 1991. Z Magazine, February 1991. Chomsky's beloved UN, which in his fantasy world is supposed to lead the way to peace, served as a, quote, democratic, end quote, fig leaf for the sanctions and weapons inspection, which were aimed at disarming neo-colonial Iraq and setting it up for a one-sided slaughter by U.S. imperialism. As Marxists, we are not only opposed to the sanctions in the U.S. war, but stood for the military defense of Iraq against U.S. imperialism while giving no political support to the capitalist regime of Saddam Hussein. In the same way, today, we oppose the U.S.'s nuclear blackmail against Iran, which it has threatened to attack. As we noted in, quote, U.S. hands off Iraq, in the event of a military attack against Iran by U.S. imperialism or by Israel or by any other force operating on behalf of the imperialists, we Marxists declare the international proletariat must stand for the military defense of Iran against imperialist attack. At the same time, we give not one iota of political support to the reactionary Tehran regime. Our defense of capitalist Iran is conditional in military conflicts between an imperialist power and a dependent semi-colonial country. Our policy is revolutionary defensism. We defend the oppressed country against the oppressed country and promote class struggle in the imperialist centers, as well as in the oppressed country. Every victory for the imperialists in their military adventures encourages more predatory wars. Every setback serves to assist the struggles of working people and the oppressed. We have also noted that in the context of threats by the nuclear-armed imperialists, Iran clearly needs nukes to defend itself and to deter a U.S. attack. Not so Noam Chomsky, who penned an article titled, quote, "A negotiated solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis is within reach," end quote, in the London Guardian, 19 June 2006. While acknowledging that the very, quote, very creditable U.S. and Israeli threats virtually urge Iran to develop nuclear weapons as a deterrent, Chomsky's response is to urge the U.S. and Israel to, quote, call off, end quote, their threats. And just in case that wasn't too much of a fantastical demand upon the U.S. imperialists, he also calls on them to, quote, take good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons, end quote. The bottom line for Chomsky is expressed in his Failed States. Of course, every sane person hopes ways will be found to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons program. The U.S. imperialist madmen, who are unique in having actually carried out nuclear holocaust with their bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, push the same line, and Chomsky is far from alone among liberals and leftists in counseling the mass-murdering imperialists on how best to disarm Iran, with the International Socialist Organization and Revolutionary Communist Party's World Can't Wait signing a petition calling on Bush and Cheney to effectively disarm Iran and inaugurate world peace. Anti-communist fighter for democratic counter-revolution. At the June 6th forum, a second SLSYC speaker challenged Chomsky over his endorsement of a 2003 declaration which echoed the U.S. imperialist hue and cry over the arrests of 78 pro-imperialist, quote, dissidents, end quote, in Cuba. Our speaker asked, please explain why in 2003 you signed on to an anti-Cuba declaration penned by none other than Joan Landy, member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and a lifelong advocate of the violent overthrow of the Cuban government. You endorsed this letter. Please tell us why you fought for the fall of the Soviet Union. Chomsky is typical of the petty bourgeois liberals and leftist intellectuals who lend their anti-imperialist credentials to U.S. imperialism's drive to overthrow the gains of the Cuban Revolution. For these types, the abstract notion of bourgeois democracy and not the proletarian class character of the Cuban state is the be-all, end-all. This was expressed clearly in the declaration Chomsky signed. We support civil liberties and democratic rights everywhere, regardless of the country's economic, political, or social system. We support democracy in Cuba. The imprisonment of people for attempting to exercise their rights of free expression is an outrageous and unacceptable. The Spartacist League understands Cuba to be a deformed workers' state, a society in which capitalism has been overthrown and workers' property forms established, but deformed by the rule of a parasitic, nationalist, Stalinist bureaucracy.